Most of the musical characteristics that we associate with the Middle East are not inherently Middle Eastern in any way. They're not unique to the region, and for the most part, they did not originate within the region. And yet, as far as pop culture is concerned, we maintain a stubbornly strong association between these characteristics and this specific region. Now, when I'm talking about Middle Eastern music here, I'm talking about the concept that Curt Sachs referred to as musical provinces. And what musical provinces are is these wider categorizations of music on the global level. So, for example, Western music. We can all agree that there is such a thing as Western music. As nebulous and as broad as the term is, there is definitely, this objective reality in which French and Norwegian music are more part of the same category than they are with Turkish and Arabic, for example. And clearly, Turkish and Arabic share more of a continuum with one another. So in this sense, musical provinces are the sum total, the aggregate of consistent correspondence between fundamental musical features. So if you have two forms of regional music and consistently they exhibit the same fundamental musical logic, then it tends to be a reasonable enough reflection of reality to group them together under the same regional umbrella. So for example, I don't think that anybody would object to the idea of putting Korean, Chinese, and Japanese music under the same musical province, keeping in mind that it's obviously meant to be very broad, that each of these individual cultures is in and of itself an umbrella with regional musical varieties, and that the degree to which we perceive them as being the same is entirely dependent on how familiar we are with them. So to a Korean person, Japanese and Korean music could not sound more dissimilar to one another, but on the level of, the global level, we can agree that they belong to the same broad musical province. But the problem with the term Middle Eastern music is that it doesn't work as a musicological category. If you were to group music together regionally, based solely on musical features, you would never get a Middle Eastern category. You'd get a much wider, much bigger musical province that does include the Middle East, but that is much bigger than just the Middle East. For example, anybody who knows remotely about Greek music, and I'm talking about like actual Greek music, not just a yogurt commercial music that they play in the West. Anybody who knows about Greek music will know that it is 100% part of the same musical province as Iranian and Arabic music. But when you point this out to people, especially Westerners, they tend to go, no, that's wrong. And they'll say that, they'll accept Iranian and Arabic being part of the same province, but they have a hard time conceptualizing how Greek music can be part of it, because they will rationalize it by saying, well, Greek music is Christian, Greek music is Western and European, and these are, and they are categorizing music over lines that have nothing to do with musicology, right? They're bringing politics and religion and geopolitical regionalizations into this. It reminds me a bit how I've heard a lot of people into linguistics talk about Indo-European music, and there is no such thing as Indo-European music, in the sense that there is no such thing as a consistent set of similar patterns within all Indo-European cultures that would justify formulating an Indo-European musical category. There's just no such thing. You can, if you want, arbitrarily decide to group together types of music along the lines of the Indo-European linguistic family, but that's just projecting a linguistic categorization onto a musicological categorization. It's not useful from the musicological point of view. And in the same sense, Middle Eastern, is a category that is more, that is, yes, musical, but also takes into account, religion, the importance of Islam, the geopolitical division of West and East, etc. If you look at the musical features that make Middle Eastern music sound the way it does, none of them are unique to the region by any stretch of the imagination. The first thing that people notice, for example, is the singing, the Middle Eastern type of singing. People call it Middle Eastern singing on YouTube and everything. Lots of twirls and quirls over one syllable of a word. This type of singing, you find it in India. And India is not a Middle Eastern country, for those who don't know. You obviously find it in North Africa, but North Africa, people agree that it is the greater Middle East or some sort of civilizational extension of Middle Eastern cultures. But, this style of singing, more importantly, is European just as much as it is Middle Eastern. You have it, it is a firmly, deeply rooted tradition within the European soil. You have it in Spain, for example. Andalusian Spanish, Southern Spanish singing exhibits those exact same features. I've heard some people say in the comments that fado music of Portugal also has that. I don't know enough about it to confirm those claims, but it seems that it is the case. And on the other side of the Mediterranean, you have, the Balkans. Serbs sing like this, Bulgarians sing like this, the Greeks. I don't know if they're Balkan essentially, but they sing like this in Greece also. Even Romanians, Musica Populară tends to be. My friend Alexandra, who's Romanian, she noticed that actually we sing just like Turks and Iranians do. Their songs with lots of twirls and curls over syllables. So my question is, if this type of singing is firmly rooted in European tradition, some European traditions, if it is just as present outside of the Middle East than inside the Middle East, why do we perceive it as being inherently Middle Eastern in some way? And usually the rationalization that most people will bring is, well, it's inherently Middle Eastern because it is originally from the Middle East. Yes, it exists in Europe now, but only due to Oriental influence. And they will point to the Ottoman Empire in the case of the Balkans. They sing like this because of the Ottoman Empire. And in Spain, they sing like this because of, Al-Andalus and the Arabic Islamic presence. This is by no means a foolish interpretation. It's very logical to make this interpretation, but it is 100% completely wrong once you take into account the actual historical data that we have available. And the historical data shows us that actually it's the opposite, but we're going to get to it later in the video. The second thing that most people recognize as being sort of what makes Middle Eastern music sound Middle Eastern is the high level of ornamentation in the way that instruments are played. Like instruments are played in this very, very highly ornamented along the melodic line. And again, most people associate that with the Middle East, but again, you have it in Spain, like Spanish guitar, classical guitar playing. That's it's exactly the same thing. In the Balkans, again, how they play their clarinets, how they play the saxophone, the way that Romanians play the accordion in Musica Populară follows the exact same logical pattern as the way that Iranians play the tar, for example. So again, my question is, if this style of ornamentation of instruments is just as present within Europe, and it's not just in the Middle East, why do we perceive it as being inherently Middle Eastern? And again, people will say, well, it's Ottoman influence for the Romanians and the Balkans, it's Arabic influence, and again, logical assumption to make, completely wrong. And we're going to talk about why. But the third thing that people notice, and that might be the most important one, is the modes. Modes are a specific succession of notes that follow one another, and certain modes have a certain flavor to them. And there's two modes that Westerners obsessively believe to be Middle Eastern: the Phrygian mode and the double harmonic major. The double harmonic major especially is the ambassador of Orientality in the eyes of the West. In the Western mind, the double harmonic major conjures up a set of associations that can be summed up something like, Westerner will hear the double harmonic major, and what they hear through it is sand, camel, Aladdin, lamp in a genie, flying carpet, Allahu Akbar, ISIS, beheadings, Allahu Akbar, boom boom, terrorists, sand, camel, sand, pyramid, pharaoh, mystical Arabian Nights, sand, pharaoh, sand, cobra, sand. Right? This is what the double harmonic major evokes for 99.99% of Westerners. And the Phrygian mode is also sort of an ambassador of Orientality and Middle Easternness in the eyes of the West. The funny thing is the Phrygian mode literally does not exist in the traditional repertoire of Iranian modes. We don't actually have it in our collection of modes. But the double harmonic major, while we do have it in all principal Middle Eastern musical cultures, it's not that widely used. And that's something that surprises Westerners, because every time the West makes a movie that is set in Egypt or, a desert country or something, they will automatically resort mostly to the double harmonic major in order to express this idea of Orientality. And so it gives them this impression that, it's such a widely used mode in Middle Eastern music, where really it's not. The frequency at which we use the double harmonic major in Iranian music, for example, is relatively low. we are much more likely to use mahur, for example, which is the exact same as the Western major scale. I was going to slip, as the Western major scale, right? And it's funny because in Western thinking, the major scale is often thought of as this paragon of Westernness. Mozart wrote many of his sonatas in the major scale, and so it's not thought of as an Oriental thing, but in Iran we use the Mahur scale much more than the double harmonic major. I could not name you one folkloric Iranian song from the top of my head, like a regional folkloric song that uses the double harmonic major. And I'm a 25-year-old Iranian who has spent the better part of most of his life documenting and at least listening to the diverse regional styles of his country's music. I could not name you one song in the double harmonic major off the top of my head, but I could name you, at least 100 that are in Mahur or the major scale. Again, Turks, Arabs, they don't use the double harmonic major that much. You know where the double harmonic major is used mostly? In the Balkans. The double harmonic major is the sound of the Balkans. It is the frequency at which the double harmonic major appears in folkloric songs is far higher in the Balkans, in Serbian music, Bulgarian music, again Greek music, than it is in Middle Eastern music. Same thing for the Phrygian mode. The Phrygian mode is the Spanish guitar scale, and in fact the Spanish are far more likely to use the Phrygian mode than the Moroccans are. So my question again is, if these modes are, just as present within Europe, if not more used in Europe often, then why do we perceive them as being somehow inherently Middle Eastern? And again, what people will say is, well, they're inherently Middle Eastern because they come from the Middle East, and the Turks brought it over to the Greeks and the Arabs brought it over to the Arabs. And this is where we get to the meat of the subject. People are right to recognize that there was cultural exchange between the Greeks and the Turks, for example. But what I always ask people who say, well, the reason Greeks use a double harmonic major is because of Turkish influence, I always ask them, based on what are you sure that this is the direction in which it went? Like, why are you certain? Why did you just jump to the conclusion that it's Turkish music that brought it to Greek music? Why not the other way around? Like, what makes you so confident that you already have jumped to the conclusion that the cultural exchange was east to west and not west to east? And usually when you ask people that question, they stop and they think, and, they have a moment of realizing that actually there is literally no specific reason for which they took for granted that it's the East that brought it to the West, right? That it's the Turks that brought it to the Greeks. There's no evidence, there's no actual hard data on which they base that certainty. And if you keep asking them, at the end they'll just go, and that's always what happens with me in these conversations, when I push them far enough, they end up going, well, come on, you can hear it is Middle Eastern because it sounds Middle Eastern, it sounds Oriental, therefore it must be the Turks because they are Oriental, it comes from the Orient. And this is the core of the problem here. The only reason why the double harmonic major in the Phrygian mode, and all these other aesthetic choices in music sound Oriental to us is because we have been conditioned to associate them with the Orient through, for the better part of 150 years, through the influence of Western pop culture and now Hollywood especially, right? That's the only reason why we feel they're Oriental. And then we take that association that we've developed and we retroactively project it into our interpretations of history. We take for granted that it must have come from the Orient because it sounds Oriental to us. But it sounds X is not, you can't go off of that in musicology. Bagpipes for most Westerners sound Scottish. But just because bagpipes, like for most Westerners, you say bagpipe, they'll think Scotland and William Wallace, kilts, etc. But, just because bagpipes sound Scottish to you does not mean that you can project that as, okay, that means they come from Scotland originally, right? Bagpipes emerged somewhere around the Middle East or the Balkans, so effectively the last place they probably reached was Scotland, right? Just because they sound Scottish to us does not mean we have to take for granted that they come from Scotland. Our associations mean absolutely nothing. When it comes to the double harmonic major, this uber-oriental, par excellence oriental mode, funnily enough, it emerges in Hellenistic Greek music, right? People take for granted that the Turks brought it to the Greeks. That's impossible because we know of the Lydian chromatic mode in ancient Greek music. And the Lydian chromatic mode, its first tetrachord, its first four notes exhibit this intervallic behavior that we think of as Oriental, as Middle Eastern. And by all likelihood, since we know that it existed in Greek music, according to this author here, I forgot his name, but I'm going to put it on the screen. It's widely accepted nowadays that the Byzantine modes are a continuation of the Greek chromatic modes, such as the leading chromatic mode. And it makes sense because the double harmonic major is called the Byzantine scale. And we call it the Byzantine scale because, as far as we know, it emerges. Sorry, it's a bit cold. It emerges in Byzantine music in the early Middle Ages. So the double harmonic major, this, the Allahu Akbar sand camel mode, seems to be a Byzantine development of the Middle Ages, which rests on earlier Hellenistic Greek musical development, which we find in the leading chromatic mode. When it comes to the Phrygian mode, it's even more interesting. The Greeks had it in antiquity. Again, it's not a Turkish thing or an Arabic thing. We know it's not because Socrates heard the Phrygian mode in antiquity. They called it the ancient Greek Dorian mode. And what's very interesting is that the Phrygian mode was, or what they called the Dorian mode, was the central mode of ancient Greek music, right? It was their C major. It was the mode that they used the most frequently. It was the highest regarded, I believe, by Aristotle or Plato. The philosophers viewed it as the most manly, perfect. It was the most widely used mode of ancient Greek music. And I find the irony in this very interesting because as far as Western pop culture is concerned, the Phrygian mode is the ambassador of Orientality to them. The same Phrygian mode was the central, most respected, most admired, most widely used mode of the very culture that birthed Western civilization. And that's the entire theme of the video right there. Within this irony is contained the theme of this video. Not only are our cultural associations and stereotypes not only do they often contradict the historical reality of music, for the most part, they're actually the mere fucking opposite of the historical reality of music. And it's scary how much people, underestimate the degree to which their understanding of world music rests chiefly on Hollywood bullshit and has nothing to do with the actuality of historical music. Curt Sachs put it very well in his book, The Rise of Music in the Ancient World, East and West. He says, "For indeed," and I'm going to quote from memory here, so I'm going to put the quote on the screen because I'm not sure I'm going to remember it right, but it's something along the lines of, "For indeed, Greek melodies were Oriental, and their next of kin have survived to this day in the Middle East, not in the West." Right? And this is something that most people know when it comes to Arabic geometry, the Islamic Golden Age, Arabic advancements in philosophy, mathematics, geography, etc. Everybody knows that these rested chiefly, to a large degree at least, upon translations of ancient Greek works. What people are far less likely and willing to admit is that the same applies to music. All the melodies that sound Arabic, Arabs took them from ancient Greek sources, right? They repurposed the tetrachords and modes of ancient Greek music, but this is something that people have a hard time admitting because it's weird for us to imagine these Arabic, Oriental-sounding melodies to have been heard by Socrates thousands of years before they had ever been adopted by the Arabs, and we know that to be the case for the Phrygian mode and the double harmonic major. They were there in ancient Greece. When it comes to the instrumentation, that whole ornamented thing, the same thing applies. Martin L. West, in his book Ancient Greek Music, says, and again I'm going to quote from my mind here, so I'm going to put the quote on screen. He says, "Another development of the Roman period was the increasing use of ornaments and melodies, something typically regarded as Oriental, but again, there is no reason to ascribe to it anything other than internal Greek development." And he goes on to say that that's probably Byzantine influence on Arabic influence, this whole way of playing, in an ornamented manner. So again, it seems to be west to east when we look at the historical data. And when it comes to singing, that's the funny thing. People always say, okay, the singing, please, Faria. You can't tell me the singing was European before it was Arabic or Middle Eastern. There's no way. Well, again, the earliest attestations that we have of this type of melismatic singing is in Old Roman chant. Old Roman chant is the earliest form of Christian liturgical singing, and Marcel Perez and his ensemble organum have spent the better part of 30 years now doing wonderful work. recreating the sound of old Roman chant and researching it. You can find it on YouTube. And when you listen to it, it becomes very clear that the way that the early Christians sang was the exact same way that the Middle Easterners sing today, in this highly melismatic way. And that's the earliest attestation that we have of it. And the most likely origin for the Islamic call to prayer, for example, is not that, like, we know that it's not the Islamic call to prayer and Islamic chanting that made Byzantine chant the way it is today. Rather, it must be the opposite, given the historical data. The most likely scenario is that the Arabs, upon encountering the Mediterranean coast at the onset of the Islamic conquests, they encountered this style of singing, which, according to this author, I'm going to put his name here, according to this author, was the pan-Mediterranean united style of singing.
Probably it was something more like a pan-Mediterranean way of singing, descending out of the from the united cultural region of the late Roman Empire, which stretched all the way from Spain to the Middle East.
And the Arabs, upon encountering this style of singing, in it found the template for their own liturgical chanting. So again, it's very interesting that our expectations are actually the very opposite of what historical data seems to show us. And what's very interesting is that when confronted with this historical data, Westerners especially tend to react by saying, well, okay, the ancient Greeks, they had the Lydian chromatic mode, but the Lydian chromatic mode must have come from Mesopotamia, right? And I'm like, but why do you expect that? Why do you say that? And again, for no other reason that to them it sounds Oriental, and therefore they have to rationalize some Eastern origin for it. Or, you say that old Roman chant was in Rome. They say, well, it must have been Jewish influence upon Roman chanting. And again, there's no reason to believe that the melismatic, what we find to be Oriental nature of old Roman chant, must have come from the East. The only reason people, that's what I find very interesting, even when confronted with all of this data, Westerners still tend to cling to, the need to rationalize it as it must have come from the Orient. Why? Because they feel it to be Oriental, but this feeling that it's Oriental is at most 200 years old. It's a modern conception born of Hollywood stereotypes and Western pop culture stereotype, and they retroactively project it onto their readings of history. I think the mistake that we make is to think of musical aesthetics the way we think of racial phenotypes. Because you look at the way that I look, obviously my ancestors were not from Scandinavia, or obviously, my friend Shinji, his recent ancestry does not lie in smack dab in the middle of the African continent. It works with racial phenotypes. There is an intrinsic link between the way that people look and the way and where they come from in the world, but no such link exists with musical aesthetics like something like the double harmonic major. These intervals, there's nothing about the climate or the weather of the Middle East that was uniquely suited in being capable of producing the double harmonic major. It could have emerged within the Aztec civilization. Perhaps such an interval existed in Neolithic Ireland for some tribes at some time. I made this song called Hymn of the Legion, for example, which has gotten quite a good number of views, actually, a fair amount of views, and I alluded to the Lydian chromatic mode in it because I thought, well, I'm making a song about ancient Rome. It's not reconstructed ancient Roman music by any stretch of the imagination, but it does allude to aspects of ancient Roman music, so I thought I'm going to use the Lydian chromatic mode, or at least allude to it. And so many of the comments were like, you stupid, this sounds Arabic. This is Roman, but you make it sound Arabic and Egyptian. You're so stupid. Why did you make it sound Egyptian? They weren't Arabs, you idiot.
Ça a été un choc pour vous et pour les auditeurs.
Oui, pour les auditeurs, voilà. Donc certains ne se sont pas remis. Certains ont fait quand ils ont entendu l'Icourgos, ils ont dit, oh, pourquoi mettre un muezzin pour chanter du chant romain? Voilà, dès qu'ils entendent trois tremblements, non, il y a beaucoup de méconnaissances dans ces commentaires à leur porte-pièce comme ça.
I just noticed that I forgot to film the conclusive thoughts of the video, so I thought I'd just do it now on my phone. We think of this sound as being Oriental, but the most likely scenario, given the historical data, is that this was once the sound of Europe and the Middle East. That Europe and the Middle East had the same overall sound, which was highly modal, melodic, melismatic, ornamented, used this wide variety of scales, and that at the onset of the Middle Ages, Europe decided to sort of, break away into its own musical tradition and develop in a different direction that involves more harmony and polyphony, but that, once this was the united sound of these two regions, that these two regions had the same musical province. And so for the most part, the presence of Oriental sounds within European territory should not be explained through Oriental influence, but rather the most likely scenario is that they have survived this sort of European Middle Eastern split, which I think is quite fascinating to think that this sound was once the sound of Europe. But anyway, this is Faria Ferji. If you've liked this video, please share, comment, and subscribe, and like on Twitter and on TikTok, and I will buy you 1/3 of a tzatziki. Thank you and have a nice day.